Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I'm very, very glad to be here. I also want to thank Professor Vatic for his very interesting presentation, which I think actually touches also upon a lot of the issues that I would like to talk about. So I think these presentations come together very nicely. I come from the field of political philosophy. So I have a slightly different vocabulary that I use, but I think that in terms of the content of our presentations and our ideas, they're actually quite similar. So I would like to talk to you today about a concept that I have called relational integration, which I want to propose as an alternative for what I call conventional conceptions of integration. And I think that the concept of relational integration can be helpful to understand social oppositions, social hierarchies, and inequalities that often emerge in context of immigration. Let me see if my PowerPoint clicker works. It does. Isn't technology amazing? So here you see kind of the standard notion of integration, which is a process in which migrants integrate into society. So it's also formulated as migrants becoming a part of society or migrants becoming accepted by society. And as been already mentioned, this notion has been widely and I think rightly criticized. So the main problem that is invoked by this conception is this image that is produced by it, which you see kind of portrayed graphically here, which generates a fundamental distinction between society on the one hand and those who need to integrate on the other. So society is kind of represented as some stable, harmonious, apparently already integrated whole, and on the other side we see those who need to integrate, mostly referred to as migrants, who are not or not yet part of this society, and they stand outside of it. And in this conception of integration, this is where the integration problem is situated. So there are people who are currently not part of the society and who need to integrate in order to become part of it. So this is where the change needs to happen. This is where the focus is of our integration conception. And this is where the agency of the integration process is also situated, in the migrant. And then receiving society may be seen as a context that can be more or less helpful in terms of integration of the migrant. But in the end, it is the migrant who needs to do the integration, and it's also the migrant who has the integration problem. The migrant needs to integrate. And I think it's also interesting how this portrays migration as an anomaly, as something that should normally not happen, that is different from what the normal situation should be, that somehow breaches the borders of an otherwise stable society. And this society, without migration, would not have to deal with integration problems. So this conception of integration, I think, is both unfeasible and undesirable. It is unfeasible because, in reality, this harmonious social entity that would be a society does not exist. There is not one norm or standard that newcomers could live up to in order to integrate. There's not one benchmark for when one is integrated enough to kind of cross the border of integration. There is no guarantee that newcomers will indeed be accepted as part of society once they have adjusted to certain standards, such as learning the language or finding a job. And on the other hand, it also fundamentally misconceives the way that people that newcomers and migrants are actually inherent part of society, just by virtue of being there, by interacting with neighbors, with colleagues, with fellow residents, and with being subordinated to the same political system, political institutions, and democratic forms of rules. So this conception paints an unrealistic picture of the process. But it does more than that. It also kind of fundamentally marks those who need to integrate as different. So I think that this conception of integration can only be attained through the subordination of those who need to integrate, because they are fundamentally marked as different. They are placed outside society until they have somehow reached this point of integration, which has stigmatizing and marginalizing implications that I think are normatively reprehensible, and if anything, create a bigger divide between those who need to integrate and those who are already part of society, rather than leading to any form of integration. So, my proposal is that if we want to be thinking about integration, if we want to make integration policies, if we want to care about integration, then we should take a different conception of the word. Not as a process where some people move towards a specific social entity that then will hopefully open up and include them, but is otherwise a closed social entity, but rather as a process that takes place in the relations between people, and these people by definition, make up a social entity together. So we take all these different people who are somehow stand into relation to each other by virtue of residing in the same territory, by being subject to the same government and the same rules as our starting point of what society is. So no one needs to become part of this society, because this presence means that one is inherently part of these relations that constitute a society in the first place. And then we look at these relations and ask, are these relations integrated? No, sorry, being too impatient. So this requires a shift in our thinking of integration. It first of all, as I just mentioned, changes where integration is situated. So we no longer speak about individuals or groups who would integrate, who are integrated to more or less to a certain extent, but instead we speak of the relations between people who can be more or less integrated. So we can only speak of the integration between people rather than the integration of people. And it also comprises a rethinking of the normative foundations of our interest in integration, by which I mean the answers to the questions, why are we interested in integration? Why would integration be something desirable? And why should we be concerned with integration problems in the first place? So like Professor Vettig, I don't believe in a neutral, non-normative conception of integration. I think integration is not something that just a social process that just exists out there and that we can neutrally, objectively describe. And I think that the normative reasons that we have for being interested in integration give shape to what kind of social phenomena we consider to be of interest for integration problems. And in doing so, I want to move my framework away from conceptions of integrations that are concerned with unity, with security, or with the protection of some alleged majority or national culture, because of the subordinating consequences that I mentioned earlier. And instead, I would propose a conception of integration that is based on an understanding of relational equality. So I think that relational integration could be useful for thinking about structural inequalities that we see emerge in context of immigration. And it's important to mention here that when we talk about equality, I do not wish to think of the integration problem as immigrants need to become equal to non-immigrants because they are currently lagging behind, because they need to be elevated, such that they score equal on indicators such as education level or income, because again, this would set the non-immigrant as the benchmark for the immigrant's integration. So rather than migrants need to become equal, I would say that relations need to become equal. And as Professor Vettig also just mentioned, this also means that some people might have to give up a specific status or a specific position in order for equality to be realized. So I explicitly distance this idea of relational integration from the notion that immigrants need to strive for proximity to non-immigrants in order for integration to happen. And instead, I want to focus on the question whether the relations between the people who together make up this society are characterized by equality. So relational equality is a concept used in political philosophy, and it's emerged in order by philosophers who wanted to distinguish their idea of equality from what they call distributive equality. And mainly, or very short, it does Relational equality doesn't ask whether stuff is equally distributed between people. It's not interested in that in the first place, but whether the relationships in which this stuff is distributed are equal. So it's concerned with what we call social standing or status as equals, which means as much as whether people regard and treat each other as equals. So relational inequality depicts a situation in which some people are, for whatever reasons, deemed inferior to others, so they get a second-class status. They are considered less worthy as moral agents, less capable as participants in the community, and as a consequence, they are also regarded as less appropriate advocates of change or critique on these unequal relations. So the relations between people are characterized by hierarchy rather than equality. And I think this hierarchy should be the central problem for our interest in integration and integration problems. So in many immigration contexts, we can observe such a hierarchy in which some people are ascribed more or less legitimacy as a member of society. So the problem that I think we should be investigating in the name of integration or relational integration are such hierarchical membership relations in which some enjoy higher standing as a member than others. So relational integration problems emerge where some people are seen as more legitimate or more rightful members, and based on this position, they are seen as more entitled to the benefits of this membership, for example, the services of a welfare state. They're also thought to have more of a right to make political demands, and the political system should give priority to their interests and needs than to those of lower standing as members. So let me provide two short examples. Current research on immigration and welfare solidarity investigates the anti-solidarity effects that are associated with immigration, and this points to situations in which people become less supportive towards the welfare state in general if they have the perception that welfare benefits go to immigrants whom they consider to be unworthy recipients of this welfare support. So some people in these situations, some people are seen as less deserving of welfare because of their migration background, which does not make them real members of society, and therefore they are not seen as equally entitled to the benefits that this membership of the society brings along. So this, to me, signals a relational integration problem. Second, an example from my own country, the Netherlands, where in 2016, the Moroccan-born Khadija Arib announced her candidacy as Speaker of the House, the Dutch House of Commons. And in reaction to this, her suitability for this position was openly questioned because of her migration background, not only by populist politicians, but also by liberal commentators. So, for example, a primary newspaper, national newspaper, questioned whether she could be sufficiently neutral in guiding debates concerning Morocco, as if other candidates do not have a certain background which could make them biased on certain topics. And in a well-respected televised political show, Arib was asked whether she was endangering the status of the Speaker of the House by giving rise to a discussion about the Moroccan background, as if she was responsible for other people questioning her suitability as a candidate. So, whereas Arib's aspiration to take on a very responsible position in the organization of Dutch democracy could, in the conventional understanding of integration, be seen as the ultimate signifier of integration, I think this whole situation signals a serious integration problem. Because Arib's entitlement to hold this democratically important position in the Dutch polity was questioned based on concerns around the legitimacy of her membership. So this integration problem is not we have people standing outside society who need to become part of it, but I think the problem is we have hierarchical relations within society through which some have higher standing than others, which amounts in inequality. So what would it mean to have equal standing as members? So what should we be striving for, I think, in terms of if we think about integration? Socially, I think it means that all members are seen as equally entitled to the resources that are offered within a society. People are equally entitled to take up space, that is, to be present and to be successful, to be equally deserving of making a good life for themselves and granted equal access to the resources that are on offer for this, without, for example, receiving accusations of stealing other people's jobs, for example, because others will be more entitled to these jobs. So no one is expected to lay low and to be humble, for example, because of a migration background. And on the other hand, I also think that members should be equally get equal space to be unsuccessful. So in times of need, they are seen as equally entitled to and deserving of the advantages of membership that are supposed to help members in disadvantaged positions, such as welfare arrangements. A migration background should not be a motive to ask anyone, either formally or informally, to provide any extra proof that they are deserving of such benefits. Nor would they need to display any extra gratitude for receiving them. Politically, all members are seen as equally entitled to participate in the decision-making processes within a society, to have their perspectives and interests equally weighed in these decision-making processes. And I think, very importantly, all members are seen as equally entitled to utter critique on the polity. So without, for example, getting accusations of why don't you go back to your own country if you don't like it here. That, I think, is a very clear signifier of a hierarchy of membership and therefore of an integration problem. So this goes further than formal participation rights. Members are seen as equally entitled to strive for change, and also, I think important, members are equally entitled, allowed to not participate. So a migration background should not create any extra duty for showing engagement and identification with the polity. And I think, just as a last point, both the social and political aspects to some extent depend on legal membership, probably in the form of national citizenship. And since legal membership generally provides social and political rights that one doesn't enjoy otherwise, and in that sense it might be a necessary condition for integrated membership relations, but it's not a sufficient condition for integrated relations. And a recent research by Irene Bloemraad, for example, shows how the extension of legal citizenship to newcomers has actually coincided with a tightening of ideas of who deserves to benefit from the advantages of legal membership. So legal membership, I think, is empirically important, but it's not the whole, far from the whole story. So to conclude, I think it's very important that we move away from an understanding of integration in which the receiving society is an integration context for the integration of others. Integration processes are, I think, processes that involve change in the hierarchy of membership relations, such that people come to recognize fellow members as equals. And these changes can be either integrative, so it would be decreasing hierarchy, or they can be disintegrative, in which hierarchy would be increased. And this affects the scope, I think, as well, of integration processes. It is often emphasized in integration research that integration is a process that takes time, that is a form of intergenerational change. And whereas I don't want to deny that integration might be a very slow process, I think we should refrain from thinking about it as a natural but temporary adaptation problem that emerges through the arrival of newcomers, and that will be resolved once people have become accustomed and adjusted to each other when the dust settles. Because I think that these hierarchical membership relations are likely to be a deeply intersectional problem, and these immigration-related inequalities are infused with problems of racism, of classism, of sexism, and these problems do not arrive with the arrival of immigrants. They are already present in the membership relations in society, and they are deeply intertwined with that. And this makes integration, I think, a far more ambiguous problem than one of transitory adaptation. So it involves the challenging of norms that constitute structural inequalities, such as ideas of white supremacy, or classes' notions of what makes for a legitimate member. So we should not portray integration problems as a temporary aberration in the functioning of politics that are otherwise democratic, liberal, inclusive, thereby implying that things will go back to normal once newcomers have found their place in their new societies. And as a last remark, I would like to kind of repeat what Professor Vedek has also said, that integration processes are likely to be very demanding of all members of a community or society. The process is very likely to be messy. Integration in some aspects of relations might lead to disintegration in other aspects. The integration between some members may coincide with disintegration between others. And it's not likely to, more integration does not necessarily mean more harmony, because I think transitions to more equal standing are very likely to constitute resistance, conflict, and power struggle. So yes, I think integration is would be a very deep form of social transition that is not likely to be smoothly, and more conflict does not necessarily mean less integration. And with that, I would like to finish my presentation. Thank you for your attention.